All right, it is finally the last day, well, for regular lectures. So I tried to warn people that the last 2 weeks of the semester, like, boom, that's it, it's gone. So I'm just going to go over the highlighted notes for Chapter 6. I think there shouldn't be any surprises for anybody. Actually, did I start these with you on Monday? I just did the alcohol with you. Did I actually start these? No, okay, I didn't think so. All right. Okay, so just we'll get started on this and then check the syllabus. You'll see exactly when the final is. If you have the points that you need to get the grade you want, you're all set. When you don't show up for that final, that becomes the one that's dropped. And I know that's unusual, but I just have these. I have 3 big sections every semester of this class. If I can just save a few trees and reducing the number of people that I have to print exams for, that's fine. So my goal is that you learn something about drugs, kind of the history, and how our society has tried to deal with it. And luckily, the fact now that maybe there's some changes occurring in our view towards addiction and how to deal with it. So in Chapter 6, basically, there's an introduction. But what you need to know, of course, is the 5 categories of hallucinogens. So don't get them mixed up. Don't get mescaline mixed up with psilocybin in terms of where it's found, mescaline in cacti, psilocybin in mushrooms. And so these are just little examples here of what's in those categories. When I introduced them, the general effects, I mentioned that these are the most difficult drugs to study. They're all usually on Schedule 1. People often are buying things. They don't know what they're getting. They may be misrepresented. The drug effects differ based on your dose, your mood, your environment. So it can be a lot of variation here. Physical effects are more dependable. All of these drugs tend to push you towards the physical side effects. So your autonomic system is saying, go, pupils dilated, heart rate increased, blood pressure increased. You should know those things by heart by now. I will mention for the emotional and mental effects, you should know the definition of 3 psychiatric terms. Illusions, mistaken perceptions. You look at a hose on the ground and for a moment it looks like a snake. Delusions, probably the most serious, are mistaken ideas or beliefs. So you feel people are following you, people are wanting to hurt you, people are plotting against you. These false beliefs can lead to a lot of distress when people are intoxicated on these drugs. Hallucinations, you're actually experiencing something that is not related to reality. There's no hose, but you still see a snake, maybe a flower on a wall, or different colors in the sky that are not there. So the first group, the one that we have the most number of drugs to talk about or chemicals to talk about, of course the big daddy, LSD. You need to know that that means lysergic acid diethylamide. Actually, specifically, it's LSD-25. Who first synthesized it? Albert Hofmann. He was working for Sandoz at the time, late 1930s, early 1940s. They thought it was going to be great. They sent it out to different labs to try and study. But unfortunately, when you look at what happened in the 1950s during the Cold War, talk about paranoid delusions, people were thinking that there were all kinds of espionage. The CIA was desperately looking for a mind control or truth serum. So those studies are now available. They're declassified. I think people should take a look at them. So that kind of put a bad light on all of LSD in particular, but all of these drugs. Prior to that kind of fear coming out, Timothy Leary, the Harvard professor, actually thought there was still some reason to experiment with these drugs. But he got into a lot of trouble because he may have given chemicals, or he was taking them himself, and he may have actually asked an undergraduate class to participate in an experiment. It was voluntary, but they didn't like it, the administration. Well, in the 1960s, when there is so many things changing in our society, can't imagine what the 60s were like. People protesting, violence occurring, parents thinking their children had gone insane on drugs and were living in communes. It was a big upheaval. The government addressed this fear. They introduced this federal drug abuse control amendments, which made it very easy to move a drug onto Schedule 1 without any real scientific evidence, just the fact that People were frightened it was going to harm their kids. You should know that, February 1, 1966. All right, so now we have still LSD manufactured today. The best is still manufactured in the San Francisco area, where that famous chemist Oswald, his image was on some of that blotter acid paper I showed you. Although there are other labs. You don't need to make a lot of LSD. The nation just uses 11 pounds per year because of the low dose that you need. So you can't weigh out the LSD powder. Nobody can weigh out micrograms accurately for distribution in mass. So people make a solution that they know how much is in one drop. And they put a drop on then a carrier. Could be paper, like blotter paper. Could be pills. Could be powder in a vial. Microdots I don't think you see too much anymore. It's like a little film. So again, if things aren't highlighted, I'm not going to ask you. The question won't be there. So we're talking about LSD. It's very dose dependent. Most people today want the lower doses. They don't want to leave their body. They want to go to a club, have a good time, run around, do things, listen to music. So 30 to 50 micrograms is usually sufficient. Then you get more of a stimulant effect. You may have some mild changes in sensory perception, but not anything that's overwhelming. A lot of people see at these low doses, they feel that everything looks funny. A lot of times people get, giddiness means you're just laughing and acting very silly because you're seeing a slight change in reality, but it's not scary. Okay, the higher doses, 150 to 300 micrograms, now you would probably experience true hallucinations. So and some of those that usually induce fear in people that aren't ready for it would be something like extreme changes in your body image, extreme changes in other people, how they look. Some people have feelings that they're actually out of their body, which can be very frightening. Okay, how does it work? Took a long time to figure it out, but the clue was LSD is an indole. Serotonin is the neurotransmitter that has an indole in its structure. So finally nailed it down to this one specific receptor, serotonin receptor, named after the chemical name for serotonin, 5-hydroxytryptamine. It's 5-HT2A receptor. So there's like 4 different kinds of receptors, and then within each group there's A, B, C. This is the 5-HT2A. LSD fits it perfectly. It actually activates it more than natural serotonin does. So this receptor gets very much stimulated. You don't need a lot of the drug to do it. And these receptors are located on nerve cells that part of their job is integration of different types of sensory input, creating the reality that we see. So we look at some of the effects. Usually people would take it orally, have a peak effect in 2 to 4 hours, but there will be some effects up to 6 to 8 hours. That's a long time. Those 5-HT2A receptors down-regulate very quickly. So a few days, maybe 3 days of trying LSD, by the 3rd day you would not have any hallucinations. You're just kind of left with the speed effects. Again, here, just repeating physical effects, think of stimulants. Mental effects, it's hard to describe it. Even people who have experienced it have a hard time explaining what it might have felt like. But one thing you do need to know is a definition of the word synesthesia. That's a scientific term meaning mixing of senses. Some people have this naturally. It seems to be a mutation or maybe a certain type of mutation that some people have. It runs in families where you naturally mix your senses. Okay. So sight might register tones of sound. Sound might create images. All right, so what are bad trips? Everybody hears that first of all. Bad trips are a very traumatic experience for people. They're acute anxiety reactions, basically panicking. People who don't expect to have the changes that they do if they get a high dose, they can't control it. And the more they get anxious, wanting it to stop, that anxiety makes their hallucinations more and more sinister. So it's kind of a feed forward. The more frightened they get, the more scary their hallucinations. And finally, they may just feel, and some people, a common theme of bad trips is that they feel like they actually are losing their mind. They kind of lose track of that. This is a drug intoxication. So people can be talked down out of a bad trip, but it does take training and specific knowledge to do that. They used to have people at concerts like Woodstock and places like that to talk people down. The worst thing that happens, though, today is young people, they may actually be scorned or laughed at during their fear, and that actually makes their friends look even more like they're not there to help them, they may be there to harm them. So what it is that when you have a that kind of an experience, a lot of people are going to suppress it. They don't want to deal with it. And so it's similar to when you have a flashback that I'll talk about in just a moment. When these people get into a situation that reminds them of the way they panicked, they may be in a situation where they feel insecure, unsafe, a little nervous, a little anxious. They relive the emotions of the bad trip. So flashbacks are not related to the drug coming out of some big storage area in your body. There's no place for your body to store drugs, okay? They're there, they're in your blood, eventually they're metabolized and excreted. So that's how your body works. Even your own body parts get recycled, okay? Nothing's there forever. So bad trips, the idea that people could freak out under the influence of LSD has kind of established this idea that you could become permanently mentally ill by taking a dose of this drug. Now, part of this was propagated in the 60s. Also, the propaganda that it would harm your DNA was also put out there to basically trying to scare individuals to not use these drugs. So it's still used today. It has been used a lot to scare young people by saying, this will do this to your brain, this is your brain on drugs, frying an egg. It's an approach that some adults take to prevent people from doing something. Unfortunately, scare tactics don't work very well if they're based on untruths. Okay. So young people figure out pretty early on, this is full of crap, they don't know what they're talking about, and you actually lose your communication with them. So it was propagated, you still hear rumors, somebody did a drug, they're in a mental institution for the rest of their life. So let's talk about that. If you look at someone, if you look at how a mental illness occurs, it's usually something that the symptoms begin to grow over years on end. The age that someone begins to show these symptoms corresponds with when they might experiment with a drug like LSD. So if they're vulnerable, if they have borderline symptoms, a drug like LSD is called unmasking things that are already there. They already have some delusions that they're trying to deal with. They hear voices in their head. They take a drug like LSD. It brings out the symptoms. They end up having to be treated. Okay? So the idea that it would suddenly permanently change your brain, there isn't any drug I can think of that does that. Okay? It's not how they work. They interact with receptors. It's not like you're taking, I mean, if you take a toxin, that like mercury or something like that, yes, you can damage the brain, mainly in the fetus in a young person, or something like lead. But that's not how psychoactive drugs work. So think of it that way. It can unmask a problem and exacerbate symptoms. It's not going to create them. So again, flashback, I already explained. People are reliving that awful experience. I will mention here this hallucinant persisting perception disorder, HPPD. This is different than just reliving the emotional panic of a bad trip. This is a case where some individuals, usually young men who've used a lot of LSD, heavy users. For whatever reason, they're doing it for a couple years of their life. They do it all the time. And there are certain sensory situations where they begin to see the changes that they observed while they were intoxicated with the drug. Remember, the drug's gone. And I'm sure that could be, if you weren't expecting it, could be very frightening. So the idea is it could be a trait similar to synesthesia. I think what's happening is they experience the drug so much that the brain, when it sees intense, maybe sensory stimulation, it says, oh, I know what to do now, and it actually remembers how to function and interpret things the way it did when they were intoxicated. So I don't know a lot about it. I have done a little research in the literature. It is now apparently enough people have experienced it that it's it exists. Okay. So that's the big daddy. LSD, most powerful, one we'll talk about. People often have the most rumors about this drug, urban legends, things like that. I'd rather have you ask somebody who actually knows about psychopharmacology or neuropharmacology rather than listen to somebody who's trying to explain their personal experience, because people have different experiences with these drugs, even the same person. Okay, I've done it twice, and I had two very different experiences. So, you know, that's something you should talk to somebody about who may know a little bit more about it. All right, so the natural indole that we talk about, psilocybin, if you know that one, that's pretty good. Some people now think that psilocybin is metabolized into psilocin, and that's actually the psychoactive compound. But the thing is, you recognize psilocybin, it's an indole, it's found in some species of mushrooms. It is not found in cacti. So if you look at the pharmacology, there's a lot of mushrooms that produce these chemicals, some in minute amounts, some in much greater amounts. The dose, 10 to 60 milligrams. So you're back up into the normal range now for drugs, not micrograms. And you will begin to have the distortions that are similar to LSD. So the active ingredient there, psilocybin, is it affecting the same serotonin receptors? It could be. It has a similar structure, that indole ring, but it doesn't seem to activate the receptor as intensely as LSD. The effects last from 3 to 6 hours. And most people say that it was a pleasant experience. So it's not the kind of thing where you panic or have a problem with dissociation from your body. Most people say, yes, it was a pleasant experience. You just have to be careful if you buy mushrooms and they say just take a little bit. That might be mushrooms that have had a drop of LSD added. You need a pretty good handful of dry mushrooms to get the dose. All right. Now, so that's the second indole. The ibogaine, the rest of these, just be able to recognize that they're indoles. We just have a quick comment about each one. Ibogaine is being studied more right now. It is extracted from a bush that grows in, I think it's basically, yes, it's Western and Central Africa. The local tribes make tea out of this leaves and bark of this bush. And at high enough doses, you do see changes in your perception. At low doses, it allows them to stay focused. They're hunters, and they have to get very close to their game, so they may sit for hours. And they use this drug to stay at alert, focused pose for long times. Not sure exactly what's going on in terms of mechanism. Morning glory seeds, some North American tribes would grind up these seeds and consume it to have a mild effect. The substance is not very strong. The Indians refer to it as aloliqui, and it was part of some ceremonies they did. It can make you very sick, these seeds, because you have to eat so many. They're very bitter. And now they actually dip the seeds in toxins, so you don't want to, they warn them, do not consume. Okay, DMT. The fifth indole. I usually get a question about this in the first week of the semester. People have heard about it. They're curious about it. Got a lot of play. But somebody came out with a book called Food of the Gods, saying it's found in the brain and da-da-da. Weird theories that it was planted there by aliens. I don't know. Anyway, the thing is, DMT now, apparently there's a synthetic form of it available in the US. But in South America, you get it from certain plants. You can't swallow it because it's broken down in the stomach. So you usually are going to chop it up, you snort it or smoke it. And usually a shaman does it to have a directed hallucination, or a young boy does it when he's going through his manhood ceremony. And so it's a tool that they use. People who have experienced it that I've talked to, former students, say it's a very different kind, very different from LSD. I have no other comment on that. The natives feel that it unmasks the hidden reality. So that they feel every plant and animal has a spirit, and this allows you to see that spirit. So there you go. All right. The sixth one, yage, is a fermented drink from this vine. It has some DMT in it, and it has some harmaline in it. That's another drug I haven't mentioned. The harmaline keeps the DMT from being digested in your stomach, so you actually can drink this, and you have this dreamy state for several hours. So you got there's your indoles. More of those than any other. Now, if we talk about the second type of hallucinogen, totally different structure. Doesn't have an indole ring. The structure actually looks more like amphetamines or adrenaline, which means they're more like dopamine or norepinephrine. So you would expect stimulant effects, not necessarily hallucinations. But the very first one, this is the only natural phenylalkylamine, mescaline, found in the peyote and St. John cactus, used by local tribes still, the Comanche, Kiowa, and Ute. They go out and gather the cacti they grow in South Texas and northern Mexico. So some of these people in the at one point were arrested. A person was gathering these cacti, and he was arrested for having in his car these plants that contain a Schedule I compound. Went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you're protected under the Constitution of saying you have religious freedom, and your tribe, your culture has used this plant for a long time. So they were allowed now to gather. They just have to carry a card. And they're members of the Native American Church of North America. So they collect about 2 million buttons. And there is some concern that the plant might be getting a little bit scarce with these droughts. Even a cactus can suffer in some of these droughts. So look at the effects. You do have to consume. If you ask what a button is, it's a slice through these round tops. They might be about that big, extremely bitter, nauseate. Some people projectile vomit for 15 to 20 minutes when they first consume them. Then the hallucinations start. So we really have to be committed. They last a long time, 12 hours. Effects very similar to LSD, although it has no indole structure. So there's still things we don't know about these drugs. And usually the natives use it for directed hallucinations, time travel to talk to ancestors, things like that. So the other type of phenylethylamine is synthetic. And this is kind of weird. It, again, is related to mescaline. It has more of a structure like amphetamine. It doesn't have hallucinations. So I don't want you to feel like we all have these things figured out. You would expect two chemicals that kind of look alike to have similar effects. Mescaline, you do have hallucinations. These designer phenylethylamines, designer psychedelics, you don't have sensory hallucinations. Although I have seen recent textbooks that says you do. So they're not, I think that's because they're assuming you do. So what do these drugs do? They really have a stimulant effect. The one that's most known today is methylene dioxymethamphetamine. So there's a methamphetamine structure within the drug. So that would make sense. You would feel some stimulant effects. This drug was not on any DEA list. It was available. People started consuming it. More people who consume it, you start having a few people showing up in emergency rooms. That's what put it on Schedule 1 in 1988. So a lot of it was being smuggled in from overseas. When that shut down because of some big busts, people caught with millions of tabs of ecstasy, sort of dried up for a while. Now apparently labs in the US are coming back online, and now one of the street names is a Molly instead of ecstasy. So in between there, people were getting things that were not really ecstasy. In terms of dosage, you would probably about 75 to 125 milligrams in a pill. Some people split them to kind of extend the period of time. We know how the drug works. I do want to go over here some physical effects. These are specific effects. I mentioned these when I talked about amphetamines, except for the last one, which is bruxism, grinding of your teeth. It could have been there in the amphetamine notes. I didn't mention it. But people who take ecstasy happen to mention it more. Clenching your teeth, grinding your teeth. Some people have sore jaws the next day. It's just a matter of excess energy from a stimulant. Your body is just burning off, having very tense, a lot of tension in muscles. And that's one place that people express that tension. The problem is that people take it for its mental effects, but what happens is you get tolerant to those effects, so people up their dose. People have taken 4 or 5 capsules in one 24-hour period. Now you've got a lot of a strong stimulant, and that leads to some problems. This drug does cause a lot of release of serotonin, and one problem is that serotonin helps you regulate your body temperature. So when you have a lot of this drug present, one of the serotonin mechanisms can get you into a state of malignant hyperthermia, which can be fatal. Usually occurring also because young people are being very active. They may be taking other drugs. They don't notice how hot they are. And they're in a club maybe where they can't really evaporate their sweat. So you get a certain body temperature, you have to be iced immediately. People need to know what to do. And most of the times in the US, people don't know what to do. Young people panic instead of being trained how to help somebody who has a problem with overdosing or something. So some people have actually died from water toxicity trying to avoid malignant hyperthermia. They keep drinking. When you're on a stimulant, a strong stimulant, you can get into repetitive behaviors. You just keep doing something over and over. They actually consume too much water. And there have been some people who had seizures. This happens with amphetamines and MDMA. They may have a borderline condition. Seizure is when all these neurons are just firing. Your GABA neurons can't keep things calm. And this drug kind of unmasks the seizure problem. Once you have a seizure, stay away from the drug that caused it. Your probability of having another one goes up. So it is something you need to be careful of. All right, what are the mental effects? People talk about it. The term ecstasy, and it's not so much, ecstasy often figures with physical pleasure. The effects of methylene dioxymethamphetamine, it's a mental effect. You feel great. You have no fear. You have heightened self-esteem. You trust your friends. You tell them anything. These people love me. I love them. And so that's the effect of the drug. So people get together and they feel totally safe and self-aware, and that is the opposite of paranoia. So if you think of somebody paranoid, people are going to hurt me, I don't understand people, I don't trust them, think of the opposite. You trust them. So some people have never felt this before. They don't have any natural empathy, and when they feel it, it's a revelation to them. And they may have long-lasting memories of it, or unfortunately, they think they can take the drug and feel that way all the time. It's caused by all of your serotonin axon terminals. Remember those cells in the brainstem, their axons branch everywhere, just like the dopamine and norepinephrine ones. Dumps all the serotonin. So it's not just, LSD stimulates one serotonin subset. With ecstasy, all your serotonin receptors are getting stimulated. And that tends to, the overall effect is an emotional uplifting effect. The serotonin seems to help people get away from depression and paranoia. Now, after you take a dose of the drug, and then some people take another dose, the next day, you're going to feel some depletion of serotonin. You'll recover, your neurons will make more, but you might feel a little depressed and confused, not the way you felt when you were high on the drug. And that's for people who think this is a revelation, they can use it to cure their depression, that's the wrong way to go. You're going to be making it worse as you deplete more and more serotonin. All right. So we've got the two first major ones. Briefly, anticholinergics. They're found in plants such as belladonna, henbane, mandrake, datura. These are plants in Europe that are often referred to in old writings, like the Bible and Shakespeare. They're known to have either toxic or psychedelic effects. So they're often referred to in, for example, in Macbeth, the three witches around the cauldron, they refer to adding henbane to that brew. So magic, sorcery, witchcraft, superstitions in the Middle Ages, that's where you had a lot of reference to these drugs. You wouldn't want to party with them today. Their mechanism of action is very different. They block acetylcholine receptors in the brain. So when that happens, you get more of a delirious state, hear voices. Some people feel like they're flying because of effects on your heart rate. And then you pass out and don't remember anything. So not exactly a great party drug. All right, that little fourth category, others, I just mentioned ketamine and its cousin phencyclidine. Ketamine is still available as an animal and human anesthetic, so people get it from stealing it from vet or medical pharmacy supplies, or they may falsify a prescription to get some of the drug. It's usually injected. They can evaporate the liquid that's in the vial, take those crystals and use them that way. So what about taking an anesthetic? How would that work? Well, you're not really wanting to put yourself to an anesthetic state. At lower doses, the idea of the anesthesia is that makes these drugs so unusual, called atypical anesthetics. Your eyes are open, your blood pressure is still high, your breathing rate's okay, but you have no response to physical stimulation. So you can do minor surgery without the person or the animal feeling it. Normally with anesthetics, with small animals, you can OD them so easily. So this is good for not reducing heart rate. People say that in these smaller doses, they have this kind of dreamlike illusion, maybe a little bit of what they call sort of detachment from the body. And they like it, okay. They mix it with other drugs, so it got a name as a club drug. So when you combine different drugs to get a certain buzz, it's hard to predict. People know what they want, and they'll find something that produces it. Now, its cousin, phencyclidine, is totally off the market now. There's no human or vet use for it. When humans came out of anesthesia with phencyclidine, they often were confused, paranoid, and had bad reactions in the recovery room. So the structures are the same. Look at the name, ketamine, phencyclidine. But phencyclidine seems to activate the receptors in the brain much more strongly than ketamine does. So if you're going to get a feeling of mind-body separation or anesthesia, that's what you can get more with this drug. So some people tend to like, it's called sensory deprivation, mind-body separation. There's a young man in that video I showed you that said you don't feel anything. He was particularly, was telling you don't feel any emotions or memories. So he must have had some bad things he was trying to suppress there. So you may, because you're not feeling things, you may actually get injured if you're taking a drug like PCP. But I just explained here that urban myth about superhuman strength, It's just that these people are paranoid. They think cops or anybody's trying to kill them. They fight violently, and they don't respond to normal pain submission behaviors. So that's where the police got the reputation. They were super strong. Also in this other mentioned Salvia divinorum, it's a member of the sage family. The dried plant is sold. Still in, I guess some areas have made it, quote, illegal. They don't even know what's in it, but they're going to make it illegal. Some people have said, oh, it's the next pot. And it's like, no, that's not true at all. So in Mexico, it's used by shamans to induce a hallucinogenic state. They drink a tea. In the US, people smoke it. They've identified the active ingredient. They've called it Salvadorum A. It's actually maybe a new neurotransmitter or a weird type of endorphin receptor. People are working on that now. Just recognize it. It's hallucinogenic. Its active ingredient is Salvadorum A. All right, well, the last category that we're talking about is the fifth one, cannabinoids. The only place you're going to find these compounds are in the marijuana plant, sometimes referred to as cannabis plant or hemp plant. All of those things have been used. And so if I say, what's the hemp plant, you would know that it's either marijuana, you could call it marijuana, or you could call it one of the varieties of cannabis. Sorry, tongue stuck there. Okay, so humans have used this plant for thousands of years, okay? It grows just about anywhere. They recognize that it had some medicinal effects, could soothe muscle cramps, help people sleep, maybe help them not feel certain types of pain. Great fiber source. If you grow the male plant 10 to 12 feet high, that central stem gets very big, has great fiber. They also recognize you get high on it, so it was an intoxicant. So there's writings about this plant all over the place. Even George Washington had a hemp plantation because England wanted rope for their ships. It was a cash crop. All right. So let's look inside the plant. It's pretty average when you see how many chemicals it has. If you ran it through a mass spec, you see about 360 different chemicals. Of those, 30 of them are fat-soluble. They can cross the blood-brain barrier, so they're psychoactive. So they get into the brain, and they have different potencies in terms of interacting with receptors there. Delta-9, tetrahydrocannabinol, is the most potent. So when people talk about THC, that's what they're talking about. If you want to get high on this plant, you want the most THC that you can get. You don't want the big male plants with the fiber. You want the small female plants with the flowers on them. All right, so we now understand how marijuana works. So you should now be able to explain it to any friends or your grandmother or your 8-year-old neighbor. How does pot work? Because I think it's important to actually know how a drug works, not be mythologizing it or talking about frying an egg in a pan. All right, so in 1992, the first places where THC binds in the brain were identified. And it's selective. It doesn't bind everywhere, which you would expect if it's a specific receptor. So when they looked at these areas where this THC was binding, they were able to finally, in 95, extract the natural chemical that stimulates these receptors. Because why in the world would you have a receptor for a plant if you didn't have a natural system that would utilize those receptors? That's true of every drug we've talked about. They have to work through something that's already there, just exaggerate what is happening there because you're probably stimulating a receptor or blocking it in an unusual way. So the very first one they discovered was called anandamide. That it means bliss in Sanskrit. Then once they isolated it, they were able to get a lot more. They finally figured out how to do it. They're very fat-soluble, these neurotransmitters. So now they just call them endocannabinoids. They don't bother with individual names. They have different chemical names, but it's a whole group. So endocannabinoids is an abbreviation for endogenous cannabinoids. As I mentioned, just like endorphin is an abbreviation of endogenous morphine. Okay, so the type of receptor is called the CB1. There's a CB2 that's found on immune system cells, but CB1 is the one that causes intoxication. So it's concentrated in 3 brain areas. So this paragraph could have at least 3 exam questions in it. So you need to know this paragraph. There are 3 brain areas: hippocampus, amygdala, and hypothalamus. What do these 3 brain areas do? What are you guys doing? Okay, 3 brain areas. And what do those brain areas control? Hippocampus, short-term memory. amygdala, novelty, hypothalamus, food intake, appetite. So now all of these effects of marijuana kind of make sense. Feelings of novelty, intoxication. In fact, if the novelty gets too strong, people can actually get paranoid. They get afraid. Hippocampus, short-term memory. While you're high, you tend to lose track of what you're saying. You may not be able to remember things. It goes away when you're not intoxicated anymore, but it can make people who are high all the time seem a little bit removed from conversation sometimes. And of course, the hypothalamus related to the munchies. We'll finally explain that. All right. When people grow a plant for certain reasons, they tend to want to cultivate it and we change the biology or the evolution of that plant. We've done it with corn plants or tomato plants. Cannabis sativa, most people would say would be the most original, robust variety. Cannabis indica is a shorter, bushier version of cannabis. Some people think it's just a variety. Others now think it's actually been pushed into a new species. The advantage of cannabis indica, it's easier to grow indoors. You can keep it smaller, keep it bushier, get more buds on that shorter plant. Unfortunately, when they focused on this characteristic, some varieties of indica have an extremely strong smell. The gene that regulates for that odor-producing protein got transferred with the characteristics of short and bushy. So that's where it got the name skunkweed. So when people are trying to grow the plant for intoxication, they want to have the highest THC they can get. Why would you want to? It's like trying to isolate a more pure form of the drug. So that's where people develop the sensimilla growing technique. You pluck out all the young male plants. So they're gone. So the female plants are growing. They begin to put out little flowers. They want to be fertilized by the pollen of a male plant. So how they use it to increase the probability of fertilization is they get a sticky resin that they put all over the bud of the flower, on the leaves, and on the petals. Now, there's no male plants there. So these female plants just keep putting more resin on their flowers, going, hey, guys, here we are. Well, it just so happens that THC is located in that resin. So the more resin, the more THC. So you get a plant. If you have just the dried or fresh buds of that female plant, very sticky, very potent. So that's where people have been concentrating on it. If you want to make clothes or material from the stem, you want the male plants. Let them get 12, 13 feet high. That central stem has lots of fiber. I think the tallest cannabis plant, sativa, 30 feet high, had a stem about that big. It was grown for its fiber. Okay. So you grow a plant, you want characteristics to give you what you need. So this kind of concentrating has been known for a long time. The country India, they have a long history of cannabis being used there. So if you get, they call a type of marijuana that doesn't have the flowers or the leaves around it, bhang. Not a lot of THC, stems and leaf that you don't want. Ganja would be where you selectively pluck and harvest the flowering tops and the few leaves around it. And then hashish, you take those flowering tops and try to compress it and just kind of concentrate the resin. And you get this hard little cake, like a thick piece of gum. And that would be hashish. So again, you're just trying to purify and isolate what it is that's getting you high. And then even from this, some people have taken hashish and then extracted hash oil, which is this brown, sticky oil that has a lot of THC in it. All right, just mentioned drug testing. This has to do with urinalysis. They're using an antibody to THC, and they're going to set it at about a sensitivity about 50 nanograms a mil of urine before a reaction occurs. If you get too sensitive, you get false positives, everything starts reacting together. Some people think that a single dose of marijuana is going to take a month to clear you out of your system. Can't talk, I'm telling you, okay? So what you want to do here is, if you have not used marijuana in a long time, you smoke a joint on Friday, by Monday, you're going to pass a urinalysis, okay? Your body will get rid of those metabolites. You don't have any lingering buildup of it in your blood. Unless you're an Olympic athlete, they're not going to take it down to the lowest level, all right? So some people have so exaggerated how long metabolites will stay that they have created a billion-dollar industry of this crap called clear and other stuff that people drink, puke, drink, and whatever, and they pass. They tell their friends, oh, you got to do this. guess what? They would have passed anyway. So, I mean, I'm just, people are often, they just listen to their friends and they do this stuff. People who haven't had any marijuana in a month are doing it, and it's making, I would say, what would you call? Somebody who's a fraud, they're making them billionaires. Okay, so I just had to mention that to people. I should let you know, I showed you an advertisement from a magazine for this pill, Marinol. It's a pill that used to contain synthetic THC. I think now it contains a slightly different, it's Dronabinol that it contains. But the idea is you take the pill, you've got cancer, you're going through chemo, or you have AIDS, you absolutely cannot eat, diseases that cause you're so sick, you smell food and you get nauseous. So you take the Marinol and now you can eat. So what part of the brain are we taking advantage of with Marinol? What structure is Marinol specifically going to be meant to affect? I just gave you 3 brain areas. Hypothalamus, thank you. A lot of people kind of sit, I don't even know if you're thinking about what I'm saying or not, but that's an exam question, okay? So I know you sit here listening, but I don't know if you're really listening sometimes. So that's what the clickers, at least try and give me a response. Do something besides being so passive. Okay, well, so Marinol now, you take it, and you can get high from it too. It's not that it doesn't affect only one type of receptor. But in addition to getting intoxicated, you will have some effects where suddenly food smells better, looks better, tastes better, and you can eat. That's how the hypothalamus gets you to eat. It causes your cortex to be much more sensitized to food. It's a good thing. Okay. All right. So if you look at other physical effects, just know bloodshot eyes. Almost everybody experiences this, some more than others. It has to do with dilation of blood vessels in the clear sclera covering your eyeball. You will have an increase in appetite. You know why? Physical effect, increase in heart rate. You will lose some muscle coordination, but you may not notice it unless you have a specific test. So the thing is here, you should know decreased tracking ability. What is that? It is related to some sports. It's the ability to anticipate where something is going to come down in an arc. So center fielders, wide receivers, they naturally know they start running to where the ball is coming down once it leaves, okay? It's a skill. If you're intoxicated with marijuana, part of the effects of your intoxication is you tend to underestimate where it's coming down. So you tend to think it's going to be closer to you than it is. So you wouldn't be intoxicated and want to do that. You could find out that suddenly your skills are reduced. But people like surfers, skateboarders, and snowboarders, they don't have to do anything like that. They say this can actually help them. They enjoy it more. Maybe because things look so much more novel. All right, can you OD on it? No, not the way you talk about with painkillers. There's just not enough anandamide receptors or any kind of endocannabinoid receptors in the brainstem neurons that control breathing. I've heard of a couple people dying. One choked on a baggie. He was trying to swallow it when cops pulled him over. Poor kid, What a way to die. So afraid of being arrested, he chokes on a baggie. So, but another, so you really can't overdose on it, which is good, thank God, but it also makes young people too brazen when it comes to other drugs. Painkillers, you can OD. All right, so it's hard to describe mental effects. So I don't think I'll naturally ask you that much out of this. Actually, I highlighted it, but there's so many different things. It's so much dependent on, what situation you're in. I will say, some people say, oh, you can never hallucinate. Well, if you're smoking pot every day, yeah, you're so desensitized, so tolerant, you will not feel much in terms of any kind of change. But if you're naive and you have not had marijuana and you get a really high dose, some people have talked about feeling movement under your feet like you're going sideways. They have some visual illusions, faces or hands look distorted. And unfortunately, the amygdala gets so stimulated that things don't just look novel, they look kind of scary and people can get paranoid. So I think that happens once in a while, and it could be, of course, frightening for people who aren't expecting it. I'm just going to say, I saw this once with a friend, the only friend I really had in San Antonio that I felt secure getting high with. And he was sitting on my couch, we were facing each other, and he keeps leaning. I'm like, what are you doing? And he'd straighten up, and then he'd lean. He felt like he was going sideways, so he was kind of leaning to compensate. I said, whoa, we got to put this bong away. Oh, my God, this is bad. So that was the only time I felt that. I don't know if he was just hadn't had pot in a while, and this was more strong than we thought, but he kept leaning. He was not aware that he was doing it. It was like he was just compensating for going sideways on my couch. Okay, so comment about mental effects. It very much can depend on your personality, who you're with, why you're doing it. It kind of, if you're up, you get more up. If you're anxious, you get more anxious. Just a couple things left here. That's it. I know we have to go. Just saying out of this, just kind of think about mirror that magnifies. If a teenager doesn't want to go to school,